There comes a quiet moment in the architecture of the psyche when solitude no longer feels like a temporary shelter, but like a verdict delivered from somewhere deeper than society, deeper even than conscious choice. It is not a sentence imposed by the world, but a conclusion reached by the inner court of the self after years of silent deliberation. When we speak of the empath who walks alone and keeps no friends, we are not describing a social failure, nor an introverted temperament that simply drifted away from people. We are observing a psychological configuration forged slowly, almost invisibly, through prolonged exposure to emotional intensity and the gradual awakening of inner discernment. Such an individual does not arrive at solitude by accident. A psyche attuned to the emotional climates of others does not suddenly abandon connection without first enduring a long period of saturation. Before the quiet, there was immersion. Before the distance, there was proximity. Before the absence of friendships, there was often an excessive presence in the lives of others. This kind of person once listened more than anyone asked them to listen, absorbed moods they did not generate, carried confessions they were never meant to hold, and mirrored emotional states until the boundary between self and other became dangerously porous. In early life, extreme sensitivity is rarely recognized as a strength. More often, it is misunderstood, utilized, or unconsciously demanded. The sensitive child becomes the regulator of emotional tension within the environment, the silent mediator, the one who senses discord before it is spoken. Over time, this role crystallizes into a persona of availability, kindness, and emotional labor. Yet beneath this socially acceptable surface, something else begins to form. Not cruelty, not indifference, but exhaustion, quiet resentment, and a deep, unarticulated longing for psychological sovereignty. When such a person eventually withdraws from social circles, from habitual bonding, and even from benign companionship, the external world frequently misreads the shift. It is labeled as coldness, arrogance, detachment, or emotional damage. But from the perspective of the psyche, something far more complex has occurred. This is not collapse. It is contraction. The psychic energy that once flowed outward indiscriminately has turned inward, not in narcissism, but in necessary recentering. What once dispersed itself through endless relational channels now seeks containment. The caution around such individuals does not arise because they intend harm. It arises because they are no longer governed by unconscious needs for validation, approval, or emotional relevance. They have crossed a psychological threshold that many never approach, largely because the cost of crossing it is steep. To remain alone while still possessing the capacity for deep connection requires more inner strength than blind attachment ever demands. Loneliness can be endured by many, but chosen solitude after emotional maturation is a rarer state, and psychologically speaking, a more potent one. Danger, in this context, does not imply destructiveness. It implies immunity. The empath who has withdrawn into solitude becomes resistant to projections. They no longer accept roles unconsciously assigned to them. They do not rush to soothe anxieties that are not their own. They cease offering their inner world as a container for unresolved conflicts in others. And because many individuals unconsciously depend on empathic figures to stabilize their own internal chaos, this shift creates unease. The familiar emotional mirror has gone silent. Within dreams reported by such individuals, certain images appear with striking consistency. Empty houses, watchtowers overlooking vast landscapes, abandoned temples, quiet forests resistant to entry. These are not symbols of deprivation. They are symbols of vigilance and elevation. The psyche has retreated, not into emptiness, but into a higher vantage point. The crowded emotional village has been left behind. What remains is perspective, distance, and a silence saturated with meaning. This silence is often misunderstood as emptiness. In truth, it is density. The empath loner has learned, often through repeated psychological strain, that proximity without boundaries leads to self-erasure. Relationships that once promised mutuality instead demanded asymmetry. They required more feeling, more holding, more forgiving, and more emotional availability than was reciprocated. Over time, the unconscious registers these patterns with precision. It observes the equation forming, connection equals depletion. And the psyche, which constantly seeks balance, eventually intervenes. What appears externally as withdrawal is frequently an act of deep self-regulation. The mind, no longer willing to remain in chronic dispersion, begins to retract its energy. Desire for social engagement may fade gradually or disappear abruptly. This is not necessarily bitterness. It is often the psyche's attempt to preserve structural integrity. Yet society tends to pathologize withdrawal because it disrupts collective norms. A person who does not seek validation cannot be easily directed. A person who no longer requires emotional mirroring cannot be easily influenced. Archetypally, this figure resembles the hermit, the watcher, the one who steps away from the marketplace of constant emotional exchange. But unlike the ascetic who withdraws from the world out of ideology, the empath loner withdraws because they have already encountered too much of the world's emotional undercurrents. Their nervous system has learned, through lived experience rather than theory, how permeable human boundaries can be. They do not retreat out of disdain for humanity. They retreat out of necessity for psychic coherence. This state is not inherently permanent. It is often an interval, a psychological winter during which the personality reorganizes itself around a more resilient center. Yet something irreversible occurs during this period. The individual realizes that connection is optional, not compulsory. Presence becomes intentional rather than reflexive. Love becomes a conscious offering instead of an unconscious obligation. And once this realization settles into the deeper layers of the psyche, a return to previous relational innocence becomes nearly impossible. When one approaches such a person with unconscious expectations of emotional availability, a friction emerges. They will not perform intimacy on demand. They will not emotionally bleed to prove sincerity. They will not automatically regulate, rescue, or redeem others simply through proximity. What they offer, if they offer anything at all, is deliberate, measured, and conscious. To those accustomed to emotional excess, this restraint may feel like rejection. Psychologically, it is closer to integration. In analytical observation, when an empath loner eventually allows another person closer again, the decision is rarely based on charm, chemistry, or shared trauma. Instead, it emerges from a subtle recognition the other does not extract. Their presence is non-invasive, non-consuming, and capable of standing without leaning. Such encounters are rare because most relationships operate unconsciously through exchange of unmet needs. The empath, due to heightened sensitivity, detects imbalance before it is consciously articulated. Over time, this produces a fatigue not of the body, but of the psyche itself. This fatigue is the exhaustion of perpetual psychic openness. Living with one's inner doors constantly open eventually becomes unsustainable. The unconscious responds by closing them. From the outside, this closure may resemble cynicism or emotional distance. From the inside, it is a developmental necessity. Individuation cannot occur while the self is endlessly dispersed across the emotional demands of others. Individuation, in depth psychological terms, is not the rejection of relationships, but the differentiation of the self from the collective psyche. The empath loner reaches a critical threshold in this process. Their solitude is not antisocial. It is anti-fusion. Dreams during this phase frequently present symbols of walls, gates, deep forests, or sealed vessels. These images do not signify fear of intimacy, as superficial interpretations suggest. They reflect a psyche protecting the containment necessary for transformation. In alchemical language, no transmutation occurs without a sealed vessel. Emotional energy that once leaked outward is now retained, concentrated, and slowly reorganized. Initially, this retention may feel strange, even alarming. A period of emotional numbness often follows, creating the illusion that the capacity to feel has diminished. But what has been lost is not feeling itself. What has been reduced is reactivity. Warmth and depth are not identical phenomena. Many relationships feel warm because they are shallow and constantly stimulated. The empath loner's inner world may appear cooler on the surface, yet it is often far denser beneath, like deep water that moves slowly but exerts quiet pressure. Observers frequently project arrogance onto the quiet, judgment onto the reserved, and superiority onto the self-contained. In reality, they are encountering a psyche that no longer mirrors indiscriminately. Most individuals unconsciously rely on empathic figures to validate their emotional narratives. When the mirror disappears, the absence of reflection destabilizes them. Rather than confronting this dependency, they may label the withdrawn empath as distant or changed. Yet internally, the psyche is reorganizing around a more authentic axis. Values shift. The need for constant interaction diminishes. Solitude transforms from absence into presence, filled with inner dialogue, dreams, symbols, and a growing relationship with the unconscious. During this period, archetypal imagery often intensifies. The individual may feel drawn to myths, wanderers, observers, and solitary guardians. These are not fantasies of superiority, but expressions of a psyche transitioning from immersion to observation, from participation to insight. However, solitude carries its own psychological risks. Without sufficient consciousness, withdrawal can solidify into defensiveness. Boundaries can become walls. Discernment can slip into contempt. The decisive factor is whether the individual remains in dialogue with their shadow. When the shadow is acknowledged rather than rejected, resentment begins to dissolve. What remains is clarity rather than bitterness. The person no longer needs to punish the world for past emotional violations. They simply no longer volunteer for them. In this stage, speech often becomes slower and more deliberate. Words are no longer used to maintain connection, but to express inner realities. Silence ceases to be something that must be filled and becomes something that can be respected. Friendship, as commonly structured, demands constant reassurance, shared narratives, and emotional synchronization. The empath loner's inner tempo has shifted. To force themselves back into habitual social rhythms would feel like a betrayal of something newly forming within. Loss also plays a subtle yet profound role in this transition. Not always dramatic loss, but cumulative relational misattunements. Small disappointments, unreciprocated emotional efforts, and repeated asymmetries eventually accumulate. The psyche rarely announces its breaking point. One day, the impulse to reach out simply fades, not as a strategy, but as a truth. At deeper levels of solitude, the individual encounters something that was previously inaccessible, the unmediated voice of the unconscious. As external relational noise decreases, inner figures advance. Dreams grow vivid. Forgotten memories surface. Symbols appear that insist on recognition rather than interpretation. This inward movement is often misinterpreted as self-absorption. Yet inwardness is not narcissism. Narcissism defends against the inner world. Inwardness confronts it directly. During this phase, former identities, especially those built around caretaking and emotional availability, begin to dissolve. This dissolution carries grief, though it is rarely publicly expressed. The loss is not of people, but of a self-structure that once provided meaning. Mourning an identity is more ambiguous than mourning a person. There are no rituals, no social acknowledgement, only a quiet internal disorientation. The question emerges not intellectually, but existentially. Who am I when I am no longer required to carry others? This liminal psychological space is unstable yet fertile. One may regress, clinging to isolation as an identity, mistaking withdrawal for depth. But when endured consciously, it allows for the emergence of a self not constructed around usefulness. The self, in depth psychology, is not the ego's ideal image but the regulating center of the psyche. Solitude creates the conditions for this center to become perceptible. Over time, compassion often expands in an impersonal direction. The empath loner may feel deeper empathy for humanity as a whole, while simultaneously reducing tolerance for entangling individual dynamics. This is not contradiction. It reflects maturation. Feeling remains intact, but the compulsion towards self-sacrifice diminishes. The heart learns to feel without flooding. The mind learns to perceive without merging. Gradually, solitude shifts again. It no longer functions purely as defense or recovery, but as orientation. The axis of the personality reorganizes from responsiveness to resonance. Instead of unconsciously asking what is needed of me here, a different question emerges. What is true for me in this moment? This question cannot be answered collectively. It must be lived in silence, through sensation, intuition, and inner alignment. As this alignment strengthens, the empath loner becomes less reactive, yet paradoxically more present. Openness is no longer automatic. It becomes conditional upon congruence. Others may perceive softness combined with solidity, reduced availability paired with increased authenticity. Old relational dynamics lose their hooks. Praise does not inflate. Blame does not penetrate. This neutrality is not indifference. It is integration in motion. In rare encounters, the empath loner may meet another presence that does not rush to fill silence, does not demand emotional proof, and does not interpret restraint as rejection. In such moments, the nervous system relaxes rather than contracts. These connections unfold slowly, with pauses, mutual sovereignty, and respect for inner rhythms. They reveal that connection need not equal depletion, and intimacy need not require psychological fragmentation. On a collective level, the emergence of empath loners reflects broader shifts in the relational landscape of modern life. Emotional exchange has accelerated beyond the psyche's natural capacity to metabolize it. Sensitivity in such an environment becomes overload. Withdrawal, then, is not merely personal adaptation, but an unconscious correction. By stepping out of excessive emotional economies, these individuals embody a counter-rhythm, slower, more contained, more discerning. Their absence from conventional social patterns can feel unsettling because it exposes how often relationships operate through unconscious dependency. Yet their solitude, when lived consciously, does not signify disconnection from humanity. It signifies a restructured mode of relating, grounded in awareness rather than compulsion. Eventually, loneliness is no longer experienced as a verdict on worth, but as a transient state within a larger psychological process. The individual becomes less an outsider and more a point of stillness, capable of sensing deeper patterns beneath surface interactions. They are less swayed by flattery, fear, or collective emotional surges because they have already survived the withdrawal of belonging itself. Such independence carries responsibility. Without reliance on social consensus, inner ethics must become more refined. Judgments slow down. Certainty becomes quieter but more coherent. They do not seek to convince or recruit. Their orientation rests internally, steady and self-contained. To encounter an empath who keeps no friends is therefore not to encounter emptiness, but density. Not absence, but consolidation. Their silence is not a void. It is a field in which unnecessary emotional noise has receded, allowing deeper psychological processes to unfold. They are not waiting to be rescued from solitude. They are inhabiting it as a stage of integration. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not their distance, but their lack of unconscious need within that distance. In a world where connection is often negotiated through hunger, longing, and mutual dependency, the presence of someone who no longer seeks to be filled by others quietly disrupts the entire relational economy. If such a phase appears in your own life, it need not be rushed or pathologized. It may be a reorientation rather than a regression, a recalibration of energy, a movement toward a more coherent inner center. Solitude, when conscious, is not exile. It is incubation, not a rejection of humanity, but a refinement of how one relates to it. And in that quiet refinement, something subtle yet powerful emerges. The ability to feel deeply without dissolving, to connect without losing orientation, and to remain present without being consumed. If this reflection resonates with you, remain with it a little longer. Stay curious. Stay attentive to the quieter movements of your own psyche. And if you wish to continue exploring these inner landscapes, you already know where to return, beyond the noise, beyond the surface, and into the deeper twists of the mind.